AITA for cutting off my brother when I learned how he really paid for his new house? The email sat in my inbox for 3 days before I opened it. Subject line: regarding your identity theft report, case number MT202488891. I stared at my phone screen in my car outside the grocery store, bags of frozen vegetables slowly thawing in the trunk, and felt something cold settle into my chest. I hadn't filed any identity theft report. My brother David had just bought a house 2 months ago, a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial in the suburbs with a pool and a 3-car garage, and I'd been happy for him. Genuinely happy. He'd worked hard, or so I thought, climbing his way up from being a line cook to managing 3 restaurants across the state. When he'd invited me over for the housewarming party, I'd brought expensive wine and told him how proud I was. I'd meant every word. Now, sitting in that parking lot with my hands starting to shake, I clicked the email open and watched my entire understanding of my family disintegrate in real time. The message came from Detective Lauren Brennan of the Financial Crimes Unit. She wanted to meet with me regarding fraudulent loan applications filed under my Social Security number, 4 of them, totaling just over $215,000. The applications had been submitted over an 18-month period, all to different online lenders who specialized in personal loans with minimal verification. My credit score had dropped from 732 to 509. There were 3 active collections agencies pursuing judgments against me, and according to the preliminary investigation, the IP address for most of the applications traced back to the Wi-Fi network at Russo's Italian Kitchen, the flagship restaurant my brother managed. I read the email 4 times, each pass making my vision swim a little more. The detective had included her direct line and asked me to call within 24 hours. I sat there until a woman knocked on my window to ask if I was okay, and I realized I'd been crying without noticing. I need to back up. I need you to understand what David meant to me, because otherwise none of this makes sense. We grew up in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Lawrence, Massachusetts, with a mother who worked doubles at the hospital and a father who left when I was 5 and David was 8. David raised me more than our mother did, not because she didn't love us, but because she was simply never home. He made my lunches for school. He taught me how to ride a bike, how to throw a football, how to talk to girls. When I was bullied in 6th grade by an 8th grader named Tommy Wolcott, David was the one who showed up after school and made it very clear that touching his little brother again would be a mistake. He went to every one of my baseball games in high school, even though he was working 2 jobs by then. When I got accepted to UMass Amherst, David threw me a party and gave me $500 in an envelope, money I knew he couldn't afford, but had saved anyway. He was my hero, my best friend, the person I trusted more than anyone else alive. So when he called me 6 months ago, voice bright with excitement, telling me he'd finally saved enough for a down payment on a house, I'd been thrilled for him. He'd been renting a small apartment in Lowell for years, talking endlessly about wanting stability, wanting to build equity, wanting to prove he'd made something of himself despite everything we'd been through. The restaurants were doing well, he said. He'd gotten bonuses. He'd been careful with his money. I had no reason to doubt him. Why would I? This was David, the brother who'd given up his own dreams of college to work full-time so I could go. The brother who'd co-signed my first apartment lease when no one else would. The brother who'd driven 3 hours in a snowstorm to pick me up when my car broke down in Vermont during my junior year. I went to the house showings with him. I helped him pick out furniture. I was there when he got the keys, standing in the empty living room while he grinned like a kid on Christmas morning. The first hint that something was wrong came about 3 weeks before I got that email. I'd been checking my credit card statement online, something I did obsessively because I was trying to improve my credit score to buy my own place eventually, and I noticed an inquiry I didn't recognize. Pinnacle Personal Lending. I Googled them. They were a legitimate company, but I'd never applied for anything with them. I called their customer service line and spent 20 minutes on hold before speaking to a representative named Joyce, who told me there was no application under my name in their system. She said sometimes inquiries showed up from pre-approval checks or marketing campaigns. I felt uneasy, but accepted the explanation. 2 weeks later, I got a collections notice in the mail for a loan I'd never taken out. The amount was $18,000. The lender was something called Fast Cash Solutions. I called them immediately, voice shaking with confusion and anger, and they told me the loan had been approved and dispersed 8 months ago. I'd made one payment and then defaulted. They had my Social Security number. They had my date of birth. They had my mother's maiden name. I filed a police report that same day at the Somerville station where I lived. The officer who took my information was a tired-looking man in his 50s named Officer Raymond Kowalski, and he'd clearly seen this before. He asked me the standard questions. Had I lost my wallet recently? Had I given my information to anyone? Did I have any reason to suspect someone close to me? That last question made my stomach turn, but I shook my head. I couldn't imagine anyone I knew doing this. He filed the report and told me to contact the credit bureaus to freeze my credit and file disputes. I did everything he said. I spent hours on the phone that week, navigating automated systems and repeating my story to representatives who sounded either sympathetic or bored. The credit bureaus froze my accounts. The lenders opened investigations. I started receiving letters in the mail, official documents with case numbers and fraud affidavits to sign. It felt surreal, like I'd stepped into someone else's nightmare. Then came the email from Detective Brennan. I called her back from my apartment, hands still trembling, and she asked me to come down to the station the next morning. She was professional, almost gentle, in a way that made me more nervous. When I arrived, she led me to a small interview room with gray walls and a table bolted to the floor. She was maybe 40, with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that looked like they'd seen every variation of human selfishness. She laid out a folder in front of me and opened it carefully. Inside were printed screenshots of loan applications, 4 different lenders, all with my information, all approved, all dispersed to bank accounts I'd never opened. The total came to $218,000. Detective Brennan watched my face as I looked through the documents, and I knew she was gauging my reaction. Was I genuinely shocked, or was I a good actor? I must have passed the test because she started asking me different questions. Questions about my family. Questions about who had access to my personal documents. Questions about my financial situation. I told her everything. About growing up poor. About David being my protector. About him being the only family I really had since our mother died 2 years ago from heart failure. I told her I couldn't imagine anyone I knew doing this, but even as I said it, something was shifting in my mind. A memory I hadn't thought about in months. David had asked me for my social security number about 2 years ago. He said he needed it to add me as a beneficiary on his life insurance policy through the restaurant, something about making sure I was taken care of if anything happened to him. I'd given it to him without hesitation. Why wouldn't I? Detective Brennan wrote this down carefully. She asked if I had any documents at David's house. Old tax returns, maybe. Birth certificates. Anything with my personal information. I thought about it. When our mother died, David had taken most of her paperwork. He'd been the one to handle her estate, such as it was. I'd been too grief-stricken to deal with practical matters. He'd told me he'd stored everything in boxes in his basement. My birth certificate was probably in there. My social security card from when I was a kid. Everything. Detective Brennan asked me to think carefully about the timeline. When had David started talking about buying a house? I pulled up my text messages with him, scrolling back, and my chest tightened. The first mention was about 19 months ago, right after the first fraudulent loan had been approved. He'd sent me a message saying he was looking at houses, asking if I wanted to come to some showings. I'd been excited for him. I'd asked how he'd saved up so much so fast, and he'd said he'd been really disciplined, cutting expenses, getting bonuses from work. I'd believed him because I wanted to believe him, because he was my brother, because he was the person who'd sacrificed everything for me. Detective Brennan let me sit with that realization for a moment before she spoke again. She told me the IP address tracking showed most of the applications had come from Russo's Italian kitchen. She'd already contacted the restaurant's owner, a man named Thomas Albright, who'd given her access to their network logs. The timestamps matched. The applications had been submitted during David's shifts, often late at night when the restaurant was closed, but David was still there doing paperwork. I felt something break inside me, not just my trust, but my entire understanding of who my brother was. Detective Brennan kept talking. She explained that they'd need to bring David in for questioning. She asked if I wanted to be the one to tell him about the investigation or if I wanted them to handle it. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up. She told me I should probably have a lawyer present for any future conversations with David, that these situations often became complicated when family was involved. She gave me the name of a victim's advocate who could help me navigate the financial recovery process. She told me identity theft by family members was more common than people thought, that trust made it easier, that guilt made it harder to prosecute. I nodded at everything she said, but I wasn't really hearing her. I was thinking about David teaching me to tie my shoes. David at my high school graduation with tears in his eyes. David telling me he was proud of me. Was any of it real? I drove to David's house that evening without calling first. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across his perfect lawn, with its perfect flower beds and perfect mailbox, with his perfect new address on it. I parked on the street and just stared at the place. $218,000. That's what my identity was worth to him. That's what our relationship was worth. I thought about all the times I'd helped him move furniture into this house, all the times I'd brought beer over to hang out on his new deck, all the times I'd admired what he'd built. It had all been built on my destroyed credit, my stolen identity, my ruined future. I got out of the car and walked to the front door, and I'm not sure what I was planning to say. Maybe I wanted him to explain. Maybe I wanted him to tell me it was a mistake, that someone else had stolen both our identities, that we were victims together. Maybe I was just hoping for anything that would let me keep believing in the person I thought he was. David answered the door with a smile that died the moment he saw my face. He knew immediately. I don't know how, but he knew. His expression shifted from confused to guarded in less than a second, and that's when I understood it was true. All of it. If he'd been innocent, he would have asked what was wrong. He would have invited me in with concern. Instead, he just stood there in his doorway, blocking the entrance to his stolen house, and waited. I asked him if we could talk. My voice came out steadier than I expected. He stepped outside and closed the door behind him, like he didn't want me contaminating his space with my knowledge of what he'd done. We stood on his front porch, and I told him I knew about the loans. I didn't tell him about Detective Brennan yet. I wanted to see if he'd come clean on his own. I wanted to give him one chance to be the brother I'd always believed he was. David went pale. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, and I watched his mind work, calculating, weighing options. Then he started talking, and everything that came out of his mouth was exactly what I didn't want to hear. He told me he'd meant to pay it all back before I found out. He said he'd gotten in over his head with some debts I didn't know about, gambling debts he'd been too ashamed to mention. He said he'd panicked when he realized how deep he was, and taking out loans in my name had seemed like a temporary solution. He said he'd been planning to clear everything up, to fix my credit, to make it right. He said he was sorry. He said he'd never meant to hurt me. He said I was his brother, and he loved me. And as he said all of this, I realized he wasn't actually apologizing for stealing my identity. He was apologizing for getting caught. There was no remorse in his eyes. There was fear, calculation, and a desperate kind of pleading, but no actual remorse. I asked him how long he'd been planning this. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He stumbled over his words, said it wasn't planned, it had just happened. I asked him again. How long had he known he was going to use my information to buy this house? He couldn't meet my eyes. I pressed harder. When he asked for my social security number 2 years ago, was it all ready for this? Was the life insurance story a lie from the start? David's face twisted into something I'd never seen before. Anger. He asked me what I expected him to do, stay poor forever? He said I'd gotten to go to college while he worked. I'd gotten opportunities while he sacrificed. He said maybe it was my turn to sacrifice something for him. The words hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't my brother talking. This was a stranger wearing my brother's face, revealing something that had maybe always been there beneath the surface. All those years of sacrifice, all that brotherly love, had it just been building up resentment? Had he been keeping score the whole time? I told him the police were investigating. I told him Detective Brennan had the IP logs from Russo's. I told him they knew about all 4 loans. I watched the blood drain from his face as he understood the situation he was in. He asked me if I'd filed charges. I told him I hadn't yet, that I was trying to decide what to do. He grabbed my arm, and for a second I thought he might actually hurt me, but he just held on tight and begged. He said if I pressed charges, he'd lose everything. The house, his job, his reputation. He'd go to jail. He said I was his brother, the only family he had left, and I couldn't do this to him. I pulled my arm free and told him he'd already done it to himself. He'd stolen my identity, destroyed my credit, and put me at risk for crimes I didn't commit. He'd done all of this while looking me in the eye and acting like my best friend. I asked him how he could do that, how he could smile and laugh and accept my help moving furniture into a house he'd bought with stolen money, stolen from me. David's expression hardened. He said I didn't understand what it was like to be him, to always be the one taking care of everyone else, to never get anything for himself. He said he'd earned this house, that he'd worked hard his whole life, and maybe bending a few rules was justified after everything he'd been through. I realized then that he genuinely believed this. He'd constructed an entire narrative in his mind where he was the victim, and I was somehow the obstacle to his happiness. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. I told him I was done. Done with him. Done with trying to understand. Done with making excuses. I said I'd cooperate with the police investigation and let the legal system handle it. He called after me as I walked back to my car, his voice cracking, saying I was destroying our family. I didn't turn around. There was no family left to destroy. He'd taken care of that himself. The next week moved in a blur of legal proceedings and documentation. Detective Brennan arrested David on a Thursday morning at Russo's Italian Kitchen, in front of his staff and customers. Thomas Albright, the restaurant owner, called me afterward. He was a gruff man in his 60s who'd always treated David well, and he sounded genuinely shocked. He told me he'd immediately terminated David's employment and offered to cooperate fully with the investigation. He also mentioned he'd be reviewing the restaurant's financial records more carefully, concerned that if David could do this to his own brother, what else might he be capable of? That phone call led to another discovery. Restaurant funds had been misappropriated. Not huge amounts, but enough. Fake invoices, inflated supply costs, money skimmed over time. The amount wasn't enough to bankrupt the business, but it added another set of charges to David's growing legal problems. I hired a lawyer, a sharp woman in her early 40s named Rebecca Sutton, who specialized in identity theft cases. She'd been recommended by the victim's advocate Detective Brennan had connected me with. Rebecca took one look at my situation and told me I was going to win this case, but winning wouldn't feel good. She was right. The process of proving I was a victim meant documenting every instance of fraud, providing evidence I'd never authorized the loans, and essentially testifying against my own brother. Rebecca filed motions to have all the debts discharged, to restore my credit, to place liens on David's assets, including the house. She was ruthlessly efficient in a way I appreciated, but couldn't emotionally process. Every legal victory felt like another nail in the coffin of my relationship with the only family I had left. David's lawyer, a public defender named Gerald Finch, who looked exhausted before he even started, tried to negotiate a plea deal. They offered partial restitution and probation if I agreed not to push for maximum sentencing. Rebecca advised me that this was David trying to avoid prison time while keeping the house. She recommended I reject it. I did. The prosecution had too much evidence. The IP logs, the bank records, the timestamps, the documents with my information that David had stored carelessly in his home office. When police executed a search warrant on the house, they'd found a folder labeled Financial that contained my social security card, my birth certificate, and printed copies of my credit reports. He'd been monitoring my credit to make sure I didn't notice the inquiries. The level of premeditation was chilling. The trial lasted 4 days. I sat in the courtroom and listened to forensic accountants explain the money trail. I watched David's face as they showed evidence of him filling out loan applications late at night after the restaurant closed, using my information, setting up bank accounts in my name, then immediately transferring the money to his own accounts. The prosecution had timeline charts, bank statements, email records. David's defense tried to argue that he'd been under financial pressure, that he'd intended to pay everything back, that family relationships complicated consent in these matters. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Langford, was having none of it. She asked David's lawyer directly if he was suggesting that family members had the right to commit fraud against each other without consequence. The lawyer stumbled through a response that basically admitted they had no real defense. On the third day, I had to testify. Rebecca had prepared me extensively, but nothing could prepare me for sitting on that stand and answering questions about my relationship with David while he sat 20 feet away, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. The prosecutor, a methodical man named Kenneth Rourke, who'd been with the district attorney's office for 12 years, asked me to describe David's request for my social security number. I told the story about the life insurance policy. He asked if I'd ever verified that I was added as a beneficiary. I admitted I hadn't. He asked why. I said because I trusted my brother. My voice cracked on that last word, and I hated myself for it. Kenneth let the moment breathe. Then he asked if I'd given David permission to use my identity for loan applications. I said no. He asked if I'd given permission for him to open bank accounts in my name. I said no. He asked if I'd received any money from these loans. I said no. Each answer felt like a betrayal, even though I was just telling the truth. David's lawyer cross-examined me, trying to establish that our close relationship and shared finances growing up meant there might have been implied permission or confusion about boundaries. I shut that down. I explained clearly that David and I had separate financial lives, that I'd never commingled funds with him as adults, that any help I'd given him had been freely offered, never expected to be repaid, and certainly never gave him license to steal my identity. The lawyer asked if I'd benefit from David losing his house since my lawyer had filed liens against it. I looked directly at David when I answered. I said I didn't want his house. I wanted my identity back. I wanted my credit restored. I wanted justice for what he'd done. The lawyer tried a few more angles, but nothing landed. When I stepped down, I felt David's eyes on me, but I didn't look back. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They found David guilty on all counts. 4 counts of identity theft, 4 counts of fraud, and after the restaurant investigation, 2 counts of embezzlement. Judge Langford scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. During those 3 weeks, I didn't hear from David at all. His lawyer reached out to Rebecca twice trying to negotiate, but there was nothing left to negotiate. The conviction stood. The only question was how long he'd spend in prison. Rebecca told me that given the amount of money involved, the premeditation, the violation of family trust, and the complete lack of remorse David had shown, we should expect a sentence in the range of 6 to 10 years. The thought of my brother spending that long in prison made me feel sick, but not sick enough to want to intervene on his behalf. Sentencing day was brutal. Judge Langford allowed victim impact statements. I'd written mine carefully, working with Rebecca to strike the right tone. I described what David had meant to me growing up. I talked about the trust I'd placed in him. I explained the practical impacts of his crimes, the destroyed credit, the stress, the collections agencies, the damage to my reputation. I talked about the emotional impacts, the betrayal, the loss of the only family I had, the inability to trust anyone the same way again. I read it in a steady voice while David sat with his head bowed. When I finished, Judge Langford asked if he had anything to say. He stood up and apologized. It sounded rehearsed, coached by his lawyer, hitting all the right notes about regret and rehabilitation and understanding the harm he'd caused. But his eyes were empty. He was sorry he got caught. Sorry he was facing consequences. Not sorry for what he'd done to me. Judge Langford sentenced him to 8 years in federal prison, with 3 years of supervised release afterward. She ordered full restitution of the $218,000 plus interest and legal fees. She ordered the house to be sold, with proceeds going toward restitution. She noted that family trust was sacred, and violations of that trust warranted serious consequences. She said David had systematically exploited his brother's love and trust for personal gain, and that such behavior struck at the heart of what family relationships should mean. David showed no emotion as she handed down the sentence. He was led away in handcuffs, and I sat there in the courtroom feeling completely numb. I'd won. Justice had been served. My brother was going to prison, and I felt nothing but hollow. The house sold 4 months later. It was bought by a young couple with 2 kids who seemed genuinely excited about the place. I wondered if they knew its history, if they cared. The sale price was enough to cover about 60% of the restitution owed to me after legal fees and liens were settled. I'd probably never see the full amount, but Rebecca had gotten my credit cleared, the fraudulent accounts removed, and my credit score was slowly climbing back toward where it had been. The financial damage was fixable. The emotional damage was something else entirely. I found myself unable to trust anyone fully. When friends offered help or asked about my personal information, even innocuously, I felt my walls go up. I started seeing a therapist, a patient woman named Dr. Angela Morrison, who specialized in trauma and betrayal. She helped me understand that what David had done was a profound violation, and that my reaction was normal, not paranoid. 6 months after sentencing, I received a letter from David. It had been forwarded through Rebecca, who'd read it first to make sure it wasn't harassment or another manipulation attempt. She said it seemed like a genuine attempt at communication, but advised me that I had no obligation to respond, or even read it if I didn't want to. I held the unopened envelope for a week before finally tearing it open. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten on prison stationery. David wrote about his daily routine, about a job he'd gotten in the prison library, about classes he was taking. Then, in the final paragraph, he tried to apologize again. He said prison had given him time to think about what he'd done. He said he understood now that he'd been selfish and cruel. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, but hoped someday I might be willing to talk to him. He signed it, "Your brother, David." I threw the letter away. Maybe that makes me cold. Maybe someday I'll regret not leaving the door open for reconciliation. But right now, 8 months after discovering what he did, I'm still putting my life back together. I'm still rebuilding my credit, still working with my therapist to address trust issues, still processing the grief of losing the person I thought was my closest family. David made his choices. He chose to betray me systematically over nearly 2 years. He chose to lie to my face while accepting my help. He chose his own comfort over my well-being. Those were his decisions, not mine. I'm choosing to move forward without him. I'm choosing to believe that cutting him off doesn't make me heartless. It makes me someone who knows their worth. Sometimes I drive past the house. I don't know why. Maybe I'm checking to make sure the new family is taking care of it. Maybe I'm torturing myself with memories of helping David move in, of believing in his success story. The place looks different now. The new owners painted the shutters blue and added a swing set in the backyard. It's becoming their home, erasing any trace of David's brief ownership. That feels right somehow. The house was never really his. It was built on fraud and broken trust, and now it belongs to people who bought it honestly. I hope they're happy there. I hope they never learn what the previous owner did to afford it. I'm doing okay now. Better than okay, actually. My credit score hit 700 last month. I'm saving for my own place, something modest and actually affordable. I've been dating someone new, a teacher named Rebecca, not my lawyer, different Rebecca, who's patient with my trust issues and doesn't push for information I'm not ready to share. I told her about David eventually, the basic facts, and she listened without judgment. She said everyone has family trauma of some kind, and mine just happens to be more dramatic than most. I appreciated the normalizing of it, the way she didn't treat me like I was broken or damaged beyond repair. I'm learning to trust again, slowly, carefully, but it's happening. People ask me if I regret turning David in. They ask if family loyalty should have mattered more than the law. They ask if I've considered that David might have been desperate, that people do terrible things when they're backed into corners. I understand the questions. I even understand the instinct behind them. Family is supposed to be sacred. But David didn't treat our relationship as sacred when he stole my identity. He didn't consider family loyalty when he destroyed my credit for his own gain. He had options. He could have asked me for help, could have filed bankruptcy, could have sought legitimate financial counseling. Instead, he chose to victimize me while pretending to be my protector. That wasn't desperation. That was calculated betrayal. So no, I don't regret cutting him off. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that the brother I loved turned out to be someone capable of this. But the decision itself? I'd make it again. The weirdest part is the grief. I didn't just lose a brother to prison. I lost the brother I thought I had, the person who existed in my memories and my heart. That person was never real. Or maybe he was real once and changed, I don't know. Either way, I'm mourning someone who doesn't exist anymore, and that's a strange kind of loss. Dr. Morrison says it's called ambiguous loss, grief for someone who's still alive but gone from your life. She says it's harder to process than regular grief because there's no closure, no funeral, no clear endpoint. David's out there in prison, living and breathing, and I'm here grieving the relationship we had. Sometimes I wonder if he's grieving too, if he's sitting in his cell regretting what he threw away. Then I remember the emptiness in his eyes at sentencing and think, probably not. I've learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about trust, respect, and genuine care for each other's well-being. David and I shared DNA, shared a childhood, shared trauma and survival. But when it came down to it, he was willing to destroy me for a house. That's not family. That's just biology. Real family wouldn't do what he did. So I'm building a new family now. Friends who've proven their loyalty. Rebecca, who's patient with my baggage. Co-workers who've become genuine support systems. People who choose to be in my life and treat that choice with the respect it deserves. That's what family means to me now. Not the accident of being born to the same mother, but the deliberate choice to care for someone and honor that care with integrity. The legal fallout continues even now. The restaurant's insurance company is still sorting through the embezzlement claims. Thomas Albright sued David's estate for damages, which means he's competing with me and other creditors for whatever money can be extracted from David's seized assets. It's messy and complicated, and I try not to think about it too much. Rebecca the lawyer handles most of it, sending me updates and documents to sign. I'm cooperating fully with every investigation because David's crimes extended beyond just me, and other people deserve justice too. It turns out the gambling debts he mentioned were real, just not the excuse he made them out to be. He owed money to some dangerous people, and instead of dealing with it like an adult, he chose to commit fraud. That was his pattern, apparently. When faced with consequences for his actions, he'd victimize someone else rather than take responsibility. Last month, I got a call from a reporter who was doing a story about family identity theft. She'd found my case through public records and wanted to interview me. I declined. My story isn't entertainment. It's not a cautionary tale for strangers. It's my life, my trauma, my ongoing recovery. I don't need to share it with the world for it to be valid. The reporter was understanding, said she respected my privacy. She asked if I had any advice for other victims. I thought about it and told her, document everything, trust your instincts, and don't let family guilt stop you from protecting yourself. She thanked me, and that was that. I'm not interested in being a spokesperson or a symbol. I'm just trying to live my life. Sometimes at night, I still think about those years when David was my hero. Were any of those moments genuine, or was he always keeping score? When he taught me to ride a bike, was he already calculating what I owed him? When he came to my baseball games, was he building credit for future betrayals? I'll never know. Dr. Morrison says it doesn't matter, that trying to retroactively analyze every moment will drive me crazy. She says what matters is accepting the reality of who David turned out to be and not letting it poison my memories of childhood. Some of those moments were probably real, even if the person who created them changed into someone unrecognizable. I'm trying to hold on to that. The good memories can exist alongside the terrible truth. They don't cancel each other out. They're just complicated, like everything else in life. I ran into Thomas Albright at a grocery store 3 months ago. He recognized me and came over, asked how I was doing. I gave him the polite answer, fine, moving forward, all that. He told me he felt guilty for not noticing what David was doing sooner. He said he'd trusted David completely, given him access to accounts and financial systems, never imagining he'd abuse that trust. I told him I understood, that I'd trusted David too, that predators are good at hiding their nature. Thomas looked at me with sad eyes and said family identity theft was apparently more common than anyone wanted to admit. He'd done research after everything happened, trying to understand. He said most victims never press charges because of guilt and family pressure. I told him I almost didn't either. Then I remembered what David had stolen wasn't just money. It was my future, my security, my ability to build my own life. Thomas nodded and said I'd done the right thing. I wanted to believe him. The house that David bought, the one that started all this, sometimes appears in my dreams. In these dreams, I'm walking through empty rooms that stretch on forever, looking for something I can't name. The walls are covered in documents, loan applications, credit reports, legal notices, all bearing my signature, but written in David's handwriting. I wake up from these dreams with my heart racing, and it takes a moment to remember that it's over, that the house is sold, that David is in prison, that I'm safe. Dr. Morrison says nightmares are normal, that my brain is processing trauma. She says they'll fade with time. I hope she's right. I'm tired of giving David space in my subconscious when I've worked so hard to remove him from my waking life. Next month marks 1 year since I got that email from Detective Brennan. 1 year since my life split into before and after. I'm not planning any commemoration. I'm just going to keep doing what I've been doing, working, saving, healing, building. Rebecca and I are talking about moving in together eventually, taking it slow because my trust issues make rushing into things difficult. She's patient, though. She understands that loving me means accepting that I come with baggage, that I need extra reassurance sometimes, that I'm rebuilding my ability to rely on people from the ground up. She says I'm worth the effort. I'm trying to believe her. David will be eligible for parole in 5 years. His lawyer has already filed something about good behavior and rehabilitation. I've told Rebecca the lawyer to notify me if there are any hearings I need to attend or statements I need to make. I'll fight his early release if given the chance. 8 years wasn't enough for what he did, but it's what the judge gave him, and I'll accept it. After he's released, I don't know what happens. Will he try to contact me? Will he show up at my home or workplace? I've filed for a permanent restraining order just in case. The judge granted it. David is prohibited from contacting me directly or indirectly for the rest of his life unless I explicitly revoke the order. That gives me some peace of mind. Whatever life he builds after prison, it won't include me. I'm not the same person I was a year ago. That guy was naive, trusting to a fault, unable to imagine that his beloved brother was capable of such betrayal. I miss that version of me sometimes. There was something innocent and hopeful about him that's gone now. But I don't want to be him again. I'd rather be someone whose eyes are open, who understands that people can hide their true selves even from those who love them most. I'd rather be vigilant and safe than trusting and victimized. That's the cost of what David did. He didn't just steal money. He stole my ability to trust blindly, to assume the best in people, to believe that family means something inviolate. Maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. Maybe I needed to grow up and see the world more clearly. But I wish I could have learned that lesson without having my life destroyed first. So when people ask me if I'm the asshole for cutting off my brother after learning how he paid for his house, I tell them the truth. I don't care if I am. David chose himself over me every single day for 2 years. He looked me in the eyes and accepted my help while actively destroying my financial future. He let me celebrate his success, knowing it was built on my ruin. That's not brotherhood. That's sociopathy. And I refuse to feel guilty for protecting myself from someone who proved beyond any doubt that he'd sacrifice me without hesitation. If that makes me the asshole in someone's eyes, I can live with that. I'm learning to live with a lot of things these days. Adding that to the list barely registers. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.